Well, this happened about the middle 50s. We had just gotten our latest trans-ocean aircraft, the Lockheed 1040G. A brand new type of airplane, replacing the Stratocruiser and the DC-4s and the DC-6s that we'd been flying. It had new engines on it. They were engines that were what we call here's where I'm going to have a problem. Instead of a carburetor, they had a fuel injection. And that means that the fuel got to the engine, and then they had a pump that injected it directly into the cylinders instead of through a carburetor. This is an important point here because it's the one reason that we were able to continue flying for a while after we got our first carburetor pressure warning light, which merely indicated the flow of fuel to the carburetor, which normally was on the engine. It was very necessary to have this pressure. Well, I'm getting ahead of the story a little bit. We were on our very first flight over. Everything worked normally, and we stayed. We had a multiple crew. We were powered. Had two captains, one co-pilot. We had two flight engineers, two radio operators. Excuse me, we did not use operators at this time. It was two navigators. And then we had a crew of flight attendants in the rear, headed by Ed Zan, who was the chief purser. We would take off, and we had bunk arrangements for each classification of service. The pilots had one bunk, the flight engineers another bunk, and the navigators another bunk. And of course they had sleeping accommodations for the cabin crew also. So we worked we left Seattle. We started out with a program of 8 hours on the deck and 4 hours in the bunk. And then we just rotated. This is for the pilots. The flight engineers and the rest of the crew, there were only two of each, were just shared at 8 hours on and 8 hours off. So we did this all the way to Tokyo, and then turned around and come back after a very short time on the ground in Tokyo. So the whole round trip took us 2.5 days, and we got half a month's work done in that time. In other words, we actually got flying time around 45, 48 hours on the round trip. Well, I had everything had gone well, no problems involved. We were flying at high altitudes as normal and going over, so we weren't anticipating any problems coming back because basically we already proved the airplane could operate at those high altitudes with no problem. I took off out of Tokyo, made the takeoff, and flew the first 4 hours, and then I went back to the bunk and turned it over to the other crew. Came back up on deck somewhat later and took over again, and by this time we were probably just west of the Shemya area. Flight of around, as I recall, around 33,000 feet. And it was 50 below zero outside. I was very comfortable inside. And shortly after I took over the captain's seat, we had our first indication of something going wrong. I mean, it turned out we had the fuel warning light on number one engine came on. Well, this indicated, of course, in a normal type engine that we were losing that power. But the power was working okay, and we discussed it. There wasn't anything really that we wanted to do about it. It was just a red light that's telling us that something's wrong. But we decided that being a new airplane, it could be anything, an error in installation. It didn't appear to be serious. And this went on, all this confusion and the decision to keep going for about 15 minutes, 20 minutes, somewhere there. Then suddenly, number two warning light come on. That really got our attention. And without trying to figure out what it was all about, immediately I had the co-pilot radio the ground that we were having mechanical problems, and it was possible that we were immediately wanted to deviate our flight plan. Instead of going to Seattle, to Anchorage for refueling, we would go to Coal Bay. This change of flight, they approved this, of course, and we kept on going, and then number three light came on. And now I figured, there's no way we're going to make Coal Bay. What am I going to do? We started thinking about what choices I had.
Yeah.
And the immediate choice, as far as I was concerned, was to get that airplane on the ground someplace just as soon as possible. The only possible, we were closest then to Umnak. We'd gone by Shemya, which is normally a landing zone for us. But I wanted to go into Umnak. Now, I was not really keen about going to Umnak for several reasons. Number one, the runway there was only 4,500 feet long. And we really need at least 8,000 feet to safely land an airplane that size. And, or 6,000 at the very minimum. And here we only had 45. The other thing wrong with the idea was that there was nobody on Umnak Island.
That's a problem.
And I wasn't very happy about that, but just solid ground seemed to be quite inviting. And then it occurred to me that we might not even get to Umnak. And we would have a ditching at sea, which is the last thing in the world that I would choose. I would choose a crash landing on the ground rather than a smooth touchdown in the sea. So I had called Eddie Zahn, the purser, to come up, and I explained to him what our problem was and said, I want you to get all the passengers into their warmest clothes, and then I want them to put their life vests on, and then get back in their seats and strap down and be ready for any kind of an emergency landing. Because we are in deep trouble here, and there's no really good outlook for our landing. Well, Eddie was a great guy. I mean, he did a wonderful job. and he kept passengers from becoming hysterical. I mean, he had control of the cabin. Incidentally, on that trip, we did happen to have a very famous individual, Lord Rennell, who was the head of the BOAC, or British Overseas Air Corporation. A very important individual. But he gave us no problem at all either. And so we're on our way down. By this time, we have all four low pressure warning lights on, and the engines are down to idle thrust. I mean, they're hardly powering anything. They're just turning. They haven't quit. But as we came down, we ended up going through 3,000 feet. Incidentally, the weather, fortunately, was very beautiful. It was a cloudless sky and an open ocean, and we could see for miles around, and it was just really a perfect day to be flying. And here we were trying to figure out how to keep on flying. I noticed when we went through 3,000 feet descending, we were just approaching the gap. We're probably 10 miles out from the gap, where we would go through this gap and make a right turn and land at Umnak. But I noticed when we went through 3,000 feet, the temperature went above freezing. And couple miles further in and closer, suddenly one engine came back on power. And so I increased the power on that engine, and I did what we call a 360. And on the completion of the 360, we got two more engines back. So now we had three engines, and then we called ground immediately and said, we're abandoning our landing at Umnak. We are proceeding on to Coal Bay. And so I got recleared to Coal Bay. And we got to Coal Bay. But before we got there, we had all four engines working normally. So we landed at Coal Bay, and of course, in the meantime, they had already sent a DC-6 on its way up there. So we had to wait around on the island until they came in, which is 3 or 4 hours. I fed the passengers on the ground, and when we got the DC-6 up there, we packed them into that, and we got into the DC-6 and flew them into Seattle. We never did find out until about 6 weeks later just what actually they determined had happened. And their answer to it was the fact that the aviation fuel has 30 to 40 parts per million of molecular water in every gallon of fuel. And what had happened, in their opinion, was that this water, this molecular water, when it hit the screen, they had a screen, of course, to keep the engine free from any impediments in the fuel. Well, every time it hit the screen, this thing would flash into a crystal of ice. And it just kept building up crystals of ice. Because at that tremendous temperature, well, there's no way they're going to thaw. And it just gradually packed the screen full of ice crystals. It was just like taking a faucet, turning it slowly off, as you took a whole turn all the fuel off. The fix, of course, was very simple. All they did was put a bypass valve on the fuel screen. So if the fuel screen ever plugged up with anything, the fuel would open the bypass valve and go around it into the engine unscreened.